This week's headline is Ultra-Processed Food Linked to Harm in Every Major Human Organ, published in The Guardian. We are bombarded with information about our health, both in the news and in trending videos on social media. We're here to explain what the evidence shows about the issues that matter to you. Welcome to the Science or Fiction podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Catherine Bates, and this week's co-host and producer is Emily McLaughlin, a master's student in health psychology at King's. We are a youth-led platform, which basically means that we make content with young people to make sure that it's relevant and accessible. If you'd like to contribute as an advisor, a producer, or a co-host, then you can complete the form on the About page at scienceorfiction.co.uk and also sign up to the newsletter for upcoming paid opportunities. Quick disclaimer that we're not offering health advice. We're explaining the evidence from the research and gathering insights from experts. This week, we're going to weigh up the evidence and find out, are ultra-processed foods harming our health? So welcome, Emily. Thanks for being here today. Why did you want to produce an episode on this topic?
Well, I feel like the discussion around ultra-processed foods has been pretty rapid in terms of it entering mainstream conversation. And that means that inevitably social media picks up on it, the media outlets pick up on it, and a lot of the nuance of the actual science then gets missed out. And I think without the nuance, there ends up being a lot of demonization of foods that people rely on. And then there's shame that gets introduced, and shame isn't good for your health, and it ends up actually doing more damage, it seems, than good. So I think it would be really great to reintroduce some understandable nuance into the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I think when I first started researching this topic or saw that Guardian article, I definitely didn't know what a UPF was, even though I've seen so many videos online, even people making specific recommendations for food. So, those ones where they're in the supermarket and they're like, don't buy this one because it's UPF, but buy this one. And it's like, well, what does that mean? How are we defining a UPF? And also from the evidence point of view, how can we determine harm in every organ, for example? That's such a strong claim. What does that mean as well?
Absolutely.
And you're completely right. There's so many types of food that we all rely on, even, I don't know, cereals, plant-based milks or whatever. Is this suddenly unhealthy? What does that mean?
Yeah. And the fact as well that even scientists, there's no consensus on the definition of ultra-processed foods. So to have people relying on this as a definition of good or bad, it just feels like there's too much moralization in it, really. And yeah, it's adding a lot of noise to something that's already quite complicated.
So to try and better understand what UPFs are exactly and how they affect health, and also how we're supposed to navigate our consumption of them, we're going to speak to Dr. Sam Dickens, who's a research fellow at University College London, and he's been running trials to investigate how UPFs affect our health. So should we get our guest in?
Yes, let's do it.
Welcome, Sam. Thanks so much for joining us today. Let's start with the basics. How are ultra-processed foods defined, and are they always unhealthy?
Yeah, really important question here to start with is what are we actually talking about? And when we think of ultra-processed foods, we should jump back a bit and think, what is a processed food and what is processing? So processing has existed for millennia, and it's from as basic as chopping a piece of fruit up, boiling, roasting, or freezing. And we typically call those minimally processed foods. It's still been processed since you plucked the apple from the tree. Now, over time, we've developed other ways of processing food. So a few hundred years ago, we can preserve foods with more sophisticated methods, help them last longer. So we've got a longer food supply. But then more recently, we seem to have newer types of methods of processing. And this is where we become really interested with ultra-processed food. And these types of processing methods, we wouldn't usually be able to do at home. So you can chop your apple at home, you can freeze it, you can put it in some Tupperware to keep it last longer in the fridge. But some of these methods in ultra processing, we can't do those at home. And that's what's interested here at the moment in this research. And about 20 or so years ago, a team in Brazil kind of started looking at the types of foods in the food supply in Brazil and how they'd shifted from these original minimally processed foods. And what they noticed was that people's diets started to have more and more of these ultra processed foods and then less of these minimally processed foods. And in order to try and capture what was the change of these foods, they weren't just looking at how much that food has been broken down. So we often think of food processing as the physical breaking down. So that apple, if I keep chopping it up, it'll become a bit softer. If I put it in a blender, it's much softer. So that's the degree of processing. And what they were interested in is what hadn't been done really before is considering the why, the purpose, the reason behind that processing. So this now links in kind of more what's called food systems. So rather than just what's the food on your plate, why is that food appeared there in the first place, or why is that food in your supermarket basket? And what they tried to look at is with these ultra processed foods, the main reason why they've been created tends to be because it's for financial gain or financial profit, in a way that previously foods were largely made for ensuring they were safe, edible, and just giving us nutritious food supply. And that's where this definition of ultra-processed food that we use in the literature most commonly comes from. It's this idea of looking at food which have this strong commercial drive in creating them in order to then fulfill the back pockets of, say, these big multinational corporations. Now, the problem is that we don't know explicitly which products are those that are making a lot of money per se. And this is where some of the confusion around the definition comes in, because we often define, the way we define ultra-processed foods with this main definition is we look for markers of what we call ultra-processing. And these are essentially ingredients or additives which largely serve a cosmetic or sensory purpose to make that food either more cost-effective to produce or make it more attractive, palatable, tasty, and more likely you'll buy it instead of the competitor's product. So it's not so much about additives per se, so that we can fortify foods. We can also preserve foods with certain additives. It's not so much about those. It's about using additives with primarily cosmetic purposes or ingredients we won't use at home, but you can end up creating the same product much more cheaply. So that's where this definition we come to today is for an ultra-processed food. It's foods that are largely driven by financial profit. In order to identify those, we use these markers of ultra-processing.
Yeah, okay. And I've seen on social media, I feel like there's debate around whether these additives, for example, are actually bad for you or not. So some people, we were saying in the intro, like some people will be like, don't buy this product, but buy this product instead. And then I've seen someone then, comment on that video being like, well, why not? Like this additive is not actually bad for you. Like it's just, making the food last longer in the fridge so that you can eat it. Like, I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes in as well.
Definitely. And so just to clarify what an additive is, it's essentially something you add to food that's not necessarily meant to be an ingredient. So it's not necessarily, the reason is not to give, say, nutritional value. So it's doing some kind of function to that food. So often it could be, say, to help preserve it, to stop microorganisms from proliferating, so your food goes off. And as you mentioned about these marks of ultra-processing, they could be making sensory changes, so a colour, a flavour, where you're not necessarily adding nutritional value, but you're changing some of the functional aspects of it. And then when we come to additives, in terms of how they're kind of regulated, at least in the UK and Europe, is the European Food Safety Authority, and they check through all these different additives, do different checks, largely based on rodents or animal studies, and largely based around kind of what we call acute short-term toxicology studies. So they'll give something to the rodent and see, does it get sick really quickly? Not so much some of the kind of the long-term outcomes we think about in humans, like obesity, cardiovascular disease, or cancer. And in the US, they're regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. And the foods you'll find in the UK that have these additives, all those additives have been reviewed by this authority group to check they're safe based on these initial principles. So by and large, based on these ideas that they're going to be acutely toxic or poisonous to us, it's very unlikely that these additives are going to have a direct effect in that way. But with ultra-processed foods, as we mentioned, these additives are serving purposes besides just providing nutritional value. And that's where they could come into play. So the fact I've used a flavor or a color may suggest that by using these industrial ingredients that are highly refined because it's way cheaper, may suggest that there have been losses in terms of some of those beneficial plant nutrients, plant compounds. And then you're adding that color back or that flavor back to make it look what it was before. Or you're imparting an even greater sensory experience to make you enjoy that more than you would a minimally processed food. So generally, when we look at additives in the food supply, particularly UK and Europe, the vast majority, like in all cases, there may be over the years certain unters we may find where evidence have certain issues. But by and large, additives in a broad sway being kind of unhealthy or dangerous, it's probably unlikely. They're probably directly fine and harmless. But they may indirectly have potential issues in the way they're being used. And some good examples of this are, so for example, a particular colour that we use in the UK is called paprika extract. And I'm pretty sure most people would agree that an extract of paprika probably isn't going to be toxic or dangerous. But it more speaks to the fact that why have you used that colour to return that product to have its original colours or greater colour. And that's more where it's around. It's the indirectness with UPF.
That's actually really helpful because the commercial driver of it in terms of the UPF definition, I didn't really understand that before, but that will make sense why some things like sugary drinks and sweets fall under the UPF banner, but so do plant milks and maybe tofu or alternative vegan supplement vegan alternatives, for example. And I didn't understand why that was before because they are such different products, but that makes sense if it's about the reason why it's being processed is to kind of drive consumerism.
Exactly, and then we can jump on it when we talk about the trial, etc. But a good way to kind of think about ultra processing and ultra processed food isn't that it's ultra processed, it's bad, but to think compared to the minimally processed version, what steps in that ultra processing, the use of these certain cosmetic additives to make it tastier, or the use of industrial ingredients. I'll give you a good example in a second. How has that changed it in a way that may not be as good as it may have been before? So this comes into a really important discussion we have in diets and nutrition sciences around food substitutions, or instead of what. So if I have an apple, it's unlikely that I will just have that apple on top of my usual diet. I'll probably end up taking something out of it without even thinking about it. And when we do research on diets, this is really important. If you have something or don't have something, what was the replacement that you had instead? And this thing becomes really important when we talk about the UPF research, because when we think about these different foods that are very different in UPF, because as you say, you can have plant-based milk or plant-based milks, plant-based meat alternatives, which nutritionally by current standards are pretty good and pretty healthy. And therefore, when you compare it to some other products or high-fat salt sugar products, they're clearly better. But the question is what would that plant-based meat alternative be, its health impacts compared to, say, minimally processed pulses or legumes? So there's these different questions about what do you compare it to that's really important. And a good example of this plant-based meat alternative space is we can think of things like tofu. So plain tofu without any kind of additives, etc., just generally a processed food. But then what you can obviously do in this ultra processing idea is you can obviously then turn products, say, to microproteins as well, from just the raw product into corn nuggets or these kind of ultra processed nuggets. And all of a sudden you've gone from that initial product, which is nutritionally quite good, you've actually stripped out about half the product of being that plant-based alternative, and now it's kind of isolated carbohydrates, it's got extra sugars and salts. And that's when you think about the ultra processing, what would have been instead and what you're having now. So yeah, it's the UPF concept is always trying to think of it in terms of instead of what, rather than necessarily they're all the same and they're all bad.
Let's get into the trial then. So in each episode, we dive into a specific journal article or a research paper to better understand the evidence. And today we're talking about your paper titled Ultra-Processed or Minimally Processed Diets, Following Healthy Dietary Guidelines on Weight and Cardiometabolic Health, a randomized crossover trial. So loads of detail in there. And that was published in Nature, and we'll link it in the show notes. But one of the things you say in the paper as you're kind of introducing the topic is that we need to strengthen the evidence base around UPFs. And I have seen that before, that like it's been criticized for being observational or based on associations. Can you just explain a little bit about what is the problem with the current evidence around UPFs, and then also what type of trial you did and why that's kind of strengthening it?
Definitely. So, like a lot of research, nothing's ever kind of perfect or finite. You always need to try and use different approaches to try and make sure that whatever we see with a certain research approach kind of matches up with different ways. And with nutrition research, we tend to find that most of the evidence is observational, partly because running experimental trials is very expensive. Now, they're very useful, but this also applies to the literature around ultra-processed foods. So, by and large, the majority of studies that link having more ultra-processed food in your diet and potential higher risks of poor health are generally from these observational studies. And more of them are what we call prospective. So rather than just asking you what you've eaten today and what your current kind of health status is in a cross-sectional design, these studies will ask you what you've eaten today or the last year, and they'll follow you up over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and then see if you then developed cardiovascular disease or diabetes, etc. And these studies collect lots of different information around your health, ethnicity, age, gender, etc., because we know all these factors can also influence your potential risk. So we want to make sure that if we're looking at UPF and your health in the long term, that it's not explained by something we already know to be important. And when we take into account these factors, we tend to find that there's still a higher risk of UPF and poor health. Now, of course, we do also need to try and experimentally investigate the different impacts of these diets. And importantly, because there's a lot of assumptions made that because our diet high in UPF means that it might be linked with poor health, that naturally a diet low in UPF or giving people minimally processed foods would naturally then lead to weight loss or not weight gain. And that's an assumption that kind of you can't just make that leap. And there's some way you can do that in observational studies, but a really good way is to actually put it to the test, put it into a study. And we talked earlier about the fact that ultra-processed foods have quite a varied nutritional makeup across the platform. So you've got the high-fat, salt, sugar, the chocolate, sweets, crisps. But you've also got your plant-based meat or milk alternatives, which nutritionally are much better. And you can actually get some of your fruit and vegetables from ultra-processed foods. You can get them from jar sauces in the UK, like tomato sauces. So this kind of led this really big gap because most UPF tends to be nutritionally poor. It tends to be things that we already recommend in our current dietary guidance. So the UK Eat Well Guide is our national dietary guidance. And you've probably heard a lot of these different things heard about it. So eating your 5 portions of fruit and veg a day, not eating too many foods high in saturated fat, salt and sugar, and trying to get enough fiber and eating a range of meals based around starchy carbs, proteins, pulses, nuts, legumes, and then also healthy fats. And what hadn't really been tested to date, so some of the observational stuff had done this to say, what happens if we give people a healthy UPF diet? Would all these bad effects go away? And that's what we tried to put to the test in our trial. So we did what's called a randomized controlled crossover trial. So I'll break this down into a few bits. One of the advantages of doing an experimental study, where rather than asking you what you're eating and following up in time, like to give you the food, is that when you have a big group of people, you can really, really well remove some of these other compounding influences. And that's what the randomization is. So I could get, say, like 100, 200 people. Some group have one diet, some group have the other diet, and then compare the differences. And if you randomize on the right things, you can generally find that the effect of those two diets in comparison. The control part means that we weren't just testing the effect of one diet alone. And this is really important because, especially when people go into trials or they get recruited, it can change people's behaviors. If you're taking part in a healthy behavior trial, whether it's diet, exercise, whatever, people in the control group will tend to end up trying to be healthier because now they've got this kind of awareness in their mind. So whenever we have these kind of trials, it's important that we have a control group that's representative of something similar, something that allows us to get the effect of the intervention diet. And then another part of our trial was that we did something called a crossover. Now, you can imagine with a typical drug trial where we give people a weight loss drug versus a placebo. If we give people the weight loss drug, after the end of the trial, people have been treated, people have lost a large amount of weight. So we couldn't exactly give them, say, the opposite arm or the opposite drug because they've already been treated. Now, with lifestyle factors such as diet or exercise, it's the way let's phrase it is use it or lose it. We all know if you train for a run for a few weeks and then you're going to drop off that horse and you try and come back after a few weeks, it's so much harder. You're not where you stopped. So your fitness levels will drop if you stop exercising. Similar thing with diet. A lot of our different markers vary quite a lot based on whether you have a healthy diet or an unhealthy diet over weeks and months. So we can use that to advantage in an experimental trial, because as you can imagine, everyone has their own different dietary patterns, different things they do. I might like to have breakfast at 9. Some people might have to have a late breakfast. And all these little factors can just maybe add up and just add a bit of confounding influence between these two groups. So instead of having two groups, we'll have everyone have both diets. So we compared a minimally processed diet and an ultra-processed diet. But the difference was that both these diets were following the current UK dietary guidance. So they contained the recommended amounts of fruit and veg, the recommended proportions of fats, carbs, and proteins, and above the recommendations of fiber per day. And all participants were randomized to receive one diet before the other in that random order. So we still got that randomization. So in case there was any effect of one diet before the other, we can then make sure that at least we randomize that. There's no order effect influenced by the randomization. And then we have a break in between. So they have the first diet. We then let participants go back to their normal diet. And by the time they start the second diet, they'll be kind of back to where they were when they started the first diet. So it allows us to then compare the effects of those diets within each person rather than between people. And that's a really effective way of conducting these trials and reducing the amount of people we may need to look at these effects between these diets. And as I said before, what was really novel about our trial was it's the first time people have been given these diets, an ultra-processed diet, over more than a couple of weeks. And the first time people have been looked at these diets in the real world. So there was one trial before where essentially people were housed in a kind of a fancy hotel for 2 weeks and given these diets that weren't necessarily healthy, kind of showed the adverse effects of ultra-processed food. What we did, which was the first of its kind, was make it, instead of a couple of weeks, 2 months long, these two diets. People were still going about their daily lives, going to work, going to their jobs, etc. And all their food and drink was provided for free. So we had it all delivered to their homes. We gave them the menu guides. It was already prepared, ready to go. So at most, they just had to heat up a meal or have it, eat it straight away. So all those kind of barriers we think about that make it difficult to eat a healthy diet, like the cost of getting a diet, the barriers to access and availability, we took all those away and we just asked them to eat the food you provided. So obviously you couldn't scale that up to the UK population, but it's really good for trying to test the effects the diets may have. And what's really important about the way we designed the trial is that we've mentioned before about how UPF may make it more, encourage you to eat more than you want without you really knowing about it. Essentially, some of the calorie density, so the calories per bite, or some of these sensory properties. So we provided participants with more calories than they necessarily needed to maintain their weight. So they're all given 4,000 calories per day, and to maintain their weight, they all need somewhere between 2.5 and 3,000. But they weren't told it was a weight loss trial. They weren't told to kind of eat everything. They were just told they're two healthy, balanced diets. We just want you to have as much as you want. Once you feel full, just leave the rest. It's all fine. And they followed these two diets for 8 weeks. And then what we found is these two healthy, balanced diets is that both diets led to weight loss. So these participants were living with overweight or obesity before. When they were on these two diets, they resulted in weight loss. And this may sound counterintuitive when we think that the UPF diet led to weight loss. This is where our discussion around instead of what comes into play. The participants we recruited all had average or above intake of UPF in the UK. So average UPF intake in the UK is about 60% of your calories. So think about all the food you eat. About 60% of the calories are coming from UPF on average in the UK. So our participants had about 50% or more. So that's kind of more average for the Southwest, so kind of London area. And because of this, and similar to this, their nutrients or the quality of their diet, according to dietary guidance, was pretty low. So they basically completely misaligned with current dietary guidance. They weren't getting all their fruit and veg portions, weren't getting enough fiber, having a bit too much salt, all this kind of stuff. So now when we give them this UPF diet, which is now nutritionally improved, this is instead of what? They're having a better diet than they were having before. And spontaneously, it was leading them to consume less calories. We can talk about mechanisms in a second. But what was really interesting is that when participants had the minimally processed diet, so still nutritionally better, but now not containing ultra processed foods, but mainly these minimally processed foods where it's just been made from scratch that you might make at home, there was actually even greater weight loss on this diet. So we can see this grading effect where a nutritionally poor high UPF diet is probably not great at all. If you actually improve the diet quality based on the current dietary guidance, that's an improvement regardless of the ultra processing or how it's been made. But what we tend to see is when that how it's been made and that ultra processing is also removed, you tend to see a similar sized effect in reducing weight again. So that was a kind of really novel finding we found there, and kind of really speaks to the fact that we should look at UPF as an effect rather than simply good or bad.
Interesting. So minimally processed is, for example, like cooking. What's minimally processed, just quickly before we go into the details?
Yeah, minimally processed, the way to think of it is imagine you went to the supermarket and looked at the grocery section where you've got all the fresh fruit and veg, or say the raw, like minced meat or uncooked chicken, and you made a meal from scratch. So essentially it's kind of those raw ingredients and you put them together. And so for our child, we had an independent caterer, a professional caterer that made all these meals from scratch. In contrast, all the ultra processed meals, so for example, these could be kind of breakfast oat bars, your protein bars, meal deal sandwiches that were kind of the nutritionally better ones. What else do we have? Kind of healthier ready meals. So when I say healthier, there was no kind of messaging around kind of lower calorie. They were just healthier in terms of no or fewer red labels and more of the green labels you see on the front for nutrients. And that was all provided, all sourced from a supermarket. So the kind of foods you may find in the supermarket that isn't the fresh fruit and veg section.
Yeah. And if we're thinking about this in the context of harm, so kind of what inspired getting into this topic was that Guardian article I mentioned in the intro, that there were these like 3 studies in the Lancet that were like really strongly like UPFs are harming different organs. So if we're thinking about all the organs, so if you think about the finding of this study is like on the other side of like, okay, how can we improve people's diets and reduce weight, and then you have this kind of positive effect in the UPF kind of guided diet. So it's like healthy but has UPFs. Like how does that fit in this context of harm? Like how do you think this is, this will be interpreted like by the field, and like how does it fit in that debate?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So the perception of what it says depends on kind of your initial stance. So those who kind of don't get the concept or think it's pointless will focus more on that initial comparison between the starting diet and then the UPF diet. So they're seeing the weight loss. Whereas when you look at the bigger picture and what the primary outcome of the trial was, which was to compare the effect between the two diets, there you're seeing significantly greater weight loss between the ultra-processed healthy diet and the minimally processed healthy diet. And when we come to talk about, so you said about some of the additives and kind of scare moment around there, and we look at the mechanisms that might be at play here as well, alongside wider evidence we have. So this UPF evidence doesn't sit in a silo. There's other bits to come together. There's a couple of potential mechanisms that all seem to fit together and align with some of the potential properties of these markers. So one of the key things is likely that UPF tend to be more calorie dense. So each bite of UPF tends to have more calories in it. Again, the fact that if you want to make these foods more tasty, we know that calorie density of foods often is a really big factor. And also if you have more salt in these foods, sodium, it can make them more palatable as well. We mentioned before that often these products are made from lots of kind of raw refined ingredients, then held together, put back together. So again, you may have a gelling agent that holds these different ingredients together, and these multiple ingredients all by themselves are completely fine, no different to what you might make at home. But they may suggest that you've got a much softer texture that's much easier to break apart and pull apart. And we also know that different textures can really influence the taste of food. So think about what's it? It literally, you put it in your mouth and it literally, you don't have to bite it, it crumbles apart. And we know that when you've got calorie dense food that's softer, it's really easy to eat at a much faster rate. And what may happen is that you're eating at a rate faster than the signals from your gut. So when you eat food, there's signals from your gut, there's hormones that go to your brain and say, right, you're eating food, you've had enough, now you can stop. But if you're eating at such a fast rate, it may take a bit longer. You may have eaten more than you would have if those signals take a bit of time to get to your brain. So that's potentially an explanation for a number of different UPF. And as we said, there's a wide range of different types of UPFs. That's not going to apply to every single one. But we do tend to find that more often than not, and we did a study in this in the UK, looking at the UK food supply, UPF tends to be more energy dense and more likely to have these properties than MPF. But also that still applies even in those that are considered more healthier. So healthier UPF still tend to be more calorie dense. And we did another piece of work where we did this kind of like for like comparison, and we looked at different types of foods that were minimally processed or ultra processed. And again, you kind of tend to see that the energy density is higher. So this kind of then speaks to, so there's other mechanisms as well. So we talk about additives, and we mentioned before that they're unlikely to have a direct effect, and we're trying to explain these bigger impacts. It doesn't mean to say that some of them may not do. It's just that the body of the evidence we have for some of these mechanisms and other factors like this, and the evidence we have for kind of some of these additives and their potential direct effect in terms of the research tools we have, it's kind of like this. So you can't say there won't ever be effect, but to kind of place the additives above kind of the nutrient quality, the calorie density, it's not a very critical way of thinking about the evidence and kind of where we need to direct our focus on. And then in terms of that, we talk about where to direct the focus is the fact that, so our trial, the cost of providing the two diets was about the same. And there's been some really, I don't know if your listeners are aware that the kind of the cost of food is a really important factor for what people can access and afford. And we see in the UK that those in the lowest income deciles tend to have much lower intakes of healthy foods. And that's largely because a really big report came out and kind of showed that healthy foods are much more expensive on average than unhealthy foods. And we found that on the update trial, both of the diets were much more expensive than kind of unhealthy foods, although they were similar. So when we kind of come back to how can we solve this and around, if people just knew how to eat healthier, that's not going to solve it. We need these kind of bigger policy, kind of systems level, looking at the whole food system to try and help people to eat healthier by making healthier foods cheaper, so they're more accessible and more affordable, and trying to break down some of these more systemic barriers. And where this gets really tricky is we talked before about the fact that Nova tries to put no classification around ultra processed food, tries to capture that commercial influence that's driving our food environment. The Nova classification was developed around 15, 20 years ago, and it splits foods into 4 groups based on both the degree of processing, so how much that food's been broken down, and the purpose, the reason behind that processing. So why has that processing been taken? And the first group are the foods you'll typically find in the fresh fruit and vegetable section in a supermarket. These are unprocessed or minimally processed foods. So they've been simply chopped, boiled, frozen, very simple processes just to make sure that that food is edible and safe to eat. So that's the purpose. It's mainly to make it nutritional and safe. The second group are called processed culinary ingredients. So these are things like fats, oils, butters. You wouldn't eat them by themselves, but you'd put them together with those minimally processed foods to make a tasty meal at home. So their purpose is essentially to kind of enhance the properties, the qualities of those minimally processed foods. The third group are called processed foods, and these are simple industrial combinations of group 1 and 2. So essentially think things like tuna and olive oil or artisanal breads, etc. So it's just basic creations or combinations. And again, the main purpose of those is largely just to ensure that you've got a more stable, longer shelf life, and also just to make foods a bit more attractive than minimally processed foods. So, for example, tuna olive oil makes it much more longer lasting. It also includes things like cheeses, which are then obviously longer lasting. And then the difference with ultra processed foods is that the whole point is to try and maximize profit to the absolute extreme. And with that, you identify them using markers. So ingredients that you'd never find in home, that you'd never find in the PCI group, and you'd never find in processed foods. So they can be often like isolated proteins, hydrogenated oils, and then also additives which have a purely cosmetic purpose. So they're not trying to improve the nutritional profile of the foods or make the food safer or more durable. It's just to make it more attractive, palatable, and want you to have it more. And those are things like your sweets, crisps, chocolates, plant-based alternatives, ready meals, sandwiches, wide range of things because of the kind of very generic term of it. And we know that commercial factors can be important in shaping kind of the marketing that children see, how that can influence their kind of wanting certain products. but also the fact that without mandatory changes, often voluntary kind of changes to kind of reduce the nutrient content of certain foods, the bad content, typically doesn't really happen. It needs kind of like more mandatory work. And then when we think about things like these mechanisms, so yes, if we can try and reduce the calorie density of some of these foods or make the foods not so soft so they kind of fall apart easier and easier to eat. But of course, these are properties that make these products more wantable, more profitable. They're not going to change them voluntarily. So that's where this issue is. We kind of know some of the main mechanisms. But in order to try and solve this problem, we need to think more wider than simply, okay, industry, go and reduce the calorie density. It's going to take more than that. So it's not down to education alone.
Yeah, it's not down to like the individual having to change their behavior. I feel like this leads quite nicely into a question that Emily had, so I'm going to be quiet.
I actually had another question. Is it okay if I, just off the back of what you said, Sam? So you mentioned that like having removed all the access barriers, which I think is so important to do in these kind of trials, and it's amazing that that was able to happen. Was there any sort of anecdotal evidence of whether or not people preferred the minimally processed or the ultra processed diet in terms of like sustaining weight loss outside of the trial and like in a real life environment? I feel like enjoying the way you eat is really important. And was there any sort of discussion amongst your participants of what they enjoyed eating when the access barriers were removed?
That is a really good question, and I can actually go into this in a fair amount of detail. So I'm not sure if I mentioned, but the trial was the first part of what we did for this big piece of work. The second half was actually a behavioural support program. So everyone who finished the trial, they went on to a behavioural support program to help them reduce their UPF intake in their normal environment, as well as trying to stick better to the current UK dietary guidance. So not just kind of avoiding UPF, but also making sure that whatever they are eating is higher in fibre, lower in fat, salt, sugar, things like this. And in order to do this, I'd say it's not just about education, but with behavioural science, we can use a range of different tools and tricks that can help people to stick with better, healthier behaviours and trying to avoid the less healthy behaviours. So they had one-to-one support with a behavioural scientist. So they sat down right at the start and said all the different things that are involved in the behaviour. So we use a model in behavioural science called COMBI. So most people think, decisions and behaviours, it's all just down to motivation. If people just try harder, they can do it. But no, there's different factors. There's capability. So that's both physical and psychological. So knowing how to do something, knowing how to make a meal, knowing where to get food from. There's physical. Do you have a kitchen? Do you have a fridge, freezer, pots, pans to actually make food? And a good example I like to use of this one is, imagine you've got a 20-foot wall and you have all the willpower in the world to get over that wall. You will do it, whatever it takes. But there's no way you're getting over that wall if you don't have a ladder. That's the point around the difference between motivation and physical capability. Then there's the opportunity. Have you got the time, means, social opportunity to do it? So if your family, friends, etc., are very stigmatizing around healthy foods, they always try and promote unhealthy foods, it's then very against your kind of like social norms to then try and eat a healthy meal. And then obviously you've got your motivation, but it's not just your kind of conscious thinking. So I need to eat healthy, I need to do X, Y, Z. There's also your automotive motivation. So your habits. And a lot of what we do is based on habit. So our behavioral tools often focus on trying to form new habits. Anyway, so that's what the framework is based around. And they had all these tools, had these discussions to help them address these different barriers or facilitators between these different domains to help achieve that UPF reduction. And we just actually, I can share with you, we just published as a preprint the results from the support program. And it's fairly varied. So some people found that actually this tailored advice guidance was really effective, managed to make massive reductions and changes, which was really effective. And generally from kind of interviews at the end of this 6-month period, is found the guidance to be really helpful and supportive, and the perceived reduction in that UPF was beneficial for their health and well-being. And what we want to do now, so this was very much like an exploratory second part to the trial. We want to see, okay, well, in theory, even though if there was like an effect of the diets, is the concept of reducing UPF as a what we call a heuristic or cognitive shortcut? Because it may be a lot easier to kind of take that advice to improve your diet and say, reduce your fat, reduce your salt, reduce your sugar, eat more fiber, have carbs, like all these kind of different messages was just one message. Maybe it's a bit more easier to follow. So we want to test that more fully now. We talked about a randomized controlled trial, but now testing that against kind of just standard guidance. So does it work better than people just having standard guidance? And understanding more about kind of how people found and how people felt. But generally from that support program, we found that people had a positive experience. But again, we want to test that further to make sure that exactly.
It's great that you've been able to do the follow-up one where it's like separate from because I think randomized control trials are often they're very insightful, but they can be quite limiting in seeing the whole picture of someone's experience. So I think that's amazing.
This is a really good point just to add on here about different types of trials you can do in research. So I mentioned before that before we ran our trial, there was one that was kind of in a fancy hotel and looked up. So that's a kind of a lab-based trial where it's great because you can literally take people's food afterwards and count how many calories they didn't eat or how many calories they did eat. But it's kind of devoid of the real world. There's only certain people that can be staying in a hotel for 2 weeks at a time and not be connected to anything outside. So it's great for those real mechanistic aspects, but it may then lose the real world relevance. Our trial was kind of loses some of that ability to be really rigorous, but it had the advantage of being the real world. So people are going about their daily lives, daily stresses, and it may reflect more what people may experience in the real world. But at the same time, we still removed a lot of these real world barriers like the cost, convenience, etc. of accessing these foods. And that's where you had this kind of last group, which are kind of behavioral support interventions where none of the food was provided to participants, but we gave them tools and techniques that are based on evidence and science to see if they can make that change in this existing food environment that we kind of need to improve as a kind of a standalone as well. So there's different kind of trials that address different questions, and none of them are necessarily kind of better or worse than others. They ask specific questions in different ways. So that kind of mechanistic stuff is really important for mechanisms, but you wouldn't necessarily use that to say what's best advice for supporting people in the real world and vice versa. So yeah, there's different trials and this is all about our triangulation. If we find these different trials kind of show similar pictures as well, it's useful to kind of then say, okay, this evidence is lining up.
Yeah, we often need multiple levels of evidence to understand how something works in health and mental health, right? So you need to understand the mechanisms that links people's diet to their health, just to understand how that process works. Then you've got to understand the almost a higher level where it's about behaviors and the different types of experiences that you just talked about as well. We need all of that.
Exactly. And it's the difference between what's called efficacy and effectiveness. Something may be kind of work really well in a lab, but then once you get to the real world, because of kind of real world influences, those effects you see might tend to be kind of wane. And we do see that the kind of the effect sizes or the difference that we see in a lab tends to get smaller and smaller as you go away from the lab and more to the real world, and the real world over time. So we tend to find that a lot of weight loss diets, etc., tend to have smaller and smaller effects, particularly over time. Again, because of these the barriers and also the kind of the response to weight loss, etc., and difficulties with sticking with certain diets in this real world.
Okay, so along the same lines, we were talking about how food can be seen as good and bad and the moralization of food, and how the shame in itself that's created from this almost demonization of blanket statements around ultra processed foods, that shame can be damaging to people's health in itself. So have you got any advice for people who are looking to navigate convenience foods whilst also living in a society with increasing food poverty?
That's a really important point, a really good question. And you're absolutely right. We've kind of discussed here that UPF, the issue is more around this food system and changes in this food system that allow basically purely financially driven decisions to shape our food environment and what's available. But the problem is some of the media discussions don't quite have that perspective. It's kind of, this is the food, this is what it does to you, you must avoid it at all costs. Here's the alternative, which costs about 5 times as much and will feed about half as much of your family, which obviously is just unfeasible for many, many people. And this is what's really important as well, is stigma itself can have really detrimental impacts. And a really good example of this in obesity. So there's a lot of kind of backwards rhetoric in the media around obesity being individual laziness, kind of a lack of willpower. And then from that, it's kind of, well, if people just tried harder, if they just did more work, they can help lose the weight. And often in healthcare as well, some of these discussions around kind of people's conditions are impacted by their whether they're living with obesity or not. And that's actually worse implications for their health and well-being than the stigma not being there. And same thing with diet, especially around UPF. One of the big issues I'm seeing is the media discussion is looking at it through this wrong lens of kind of education, individual kind of fault. People just need to try harder. And you end up with these similar issues around kind of stigmatizing people and giving people no option. Where do you turn to? And we talked there about the kind of the UPF being kind of an effect rather than good or bad. And the problem with this kind of all UPF is equally bad and demonized is that some of these healthier options or some of these kind of more cost-effective options, people are then going to look at those and think, oh, right, I must avoid those as well. So this just isn't helpful at all. And I'm generally quite conscious about not making any specific recommendations because, as I mentioned before about all these different barriers, I can make a certain recommendation that only applies to a certain set. It depends on the people. And generally, obviously, say one of the biggest thing is two things, cost and availability. If healthy foods were far more cheap and far more accessible, particularly in kind of lower kind of income areas, that would make a huge difference. But yeah, I genuinely try to avoid anything because you never quite realize what you're saying in effect. So for example, if I say, well, you could kind of meal prep on a Sunday and get lots of ingredients and then do that, but that then implies that you've got the cooking skills, you've got the fact that you've got a fridge or a freezer to store it in. So it's making these assumptions that I don't know about. So yeah, it's down to an individual case. And what we really need actually is just a better food system where health and the environment, we kind of don't talk so much about the environment, but these two important factors in our kind of society are just as important as turning a financial profit from the foods that are sold. And then within that, whether we can use some of these behavioral resources. So what we're doing at the trial we talked about, we're trying to collaborate with different research groups. So we're trying to make so you can actually see all the educational resources and kind of behavioral support tools that we use that kind of we can hopefully adapt. And what we hope is actually within this kind of the way I describe it is a bit like riding a bike with stabilizers. With our current food system, you're kind of stuck with these stabilizers as to how much you can move. And hopefully with these behavioral support tools, it just helps widen those stabilizers so you've got a bit more room to move how you need to go. But yeah, I think the key thing to take is there's no kind of one piece of good guidance, I think, for any single overlapping.
I think that's really helpful. And also bringing it back to like the system changes that are needed. Like, I think that's still useful for people to understand. For the Eat Well guidance, for example, would you say that that's like a good place to start if people like are unsure about how to approach this? And also I feel like one of the messages from like a recommendation standpoint is maybe to ignore the suggestions on social media of like buy this fancy expensive product and don't buy this one. Like instead it's about like taking your own approach to like what's convenient for you, what can afford, where can you start. And then on that line as well, I think it was helpful that you raised that in some tomato sauces, for example, in the UK, or different jars of things, you can actually get like your some veg intake from that. And I saw a video of a nutritionist talking in prep for this episode about how like baked beans are also fine, like a good source of fiber and like that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly this, right? So the way I like to, in terms of what to follow, if you are on a, if you've got the ability to kind of choose and decide what you want to buy, is focus on the Eat Well guide, focus on what foods are going to be lower in fat, salt, sugar, higher in fiber, and within your budget, and that you can make a meal from. The way I like to think of it is what's missing from the current dietary guidance could be captured by UPF, or think about these commercial factors. For me, that sits outside of kind of what we're telling people. That sits within policy and what we do at a bigger food system. So it shouldn't be at people's minds of whether it's UPF or not. We should be thinking more about how we can make healthier foods more accessible and affordable. And also on this list, we talked about the fact that UPF, the definitions are markers. Now, always the issue with a marker-based system is you can gamify it. And we've seen this with some of the product reformulations over the last year or so, is focusing on what the definition says and what it's trying to capture, because we can't directly capture that because of various reasons we'll talk about. In that there's no mandatory reporting around big companies and their food product sales, so we don't know what's healthy, what they're selling that's unhealthy, and therefore it means that for me, using UPF as a labeling tool isn't necessarily going to give you the most bang for your buck. So I say focus on the current dietary guidance. Beyond that, which isn't necessarily captured in the guidance, is calorie density. So again, it's on a package how many calories per bite of food, 100 grams. That's pretty important for how much you eat, and then how soft is the food. But again, that's a lot of messages to take into one, and I'd rather see a lot of that messaging and the action taken further upstream, so that what people see in a supermarket facilitates that at a much easier level. We know that money makes the world go round, and making products more tasty, cheap, attractive makes them more profitable. Let's actually directly connect the profit of these products to kind of some of these kind of characteristics. So are the most profitable products the ones that contain the additives? Are they the ones containing the textural properties? Are they the ones that are most calorie dense? So for me, that's where I think the ideal solution is. It's rather moving away from more kind of markers and kind of inferring what's bad, and actually trying to link exactly, here are the products that sell a lot and make a lot of money and they're aggressively marketed, and here are their product characteristics, and here are the ones that are actually healthier and they're not selling so well. And then you could then compare and contrast. And I think that's where we should really be going. But yeah, long story short is different ways of doing it.
Yeah, and it needs to come from regulations from like government and also companies. We can't just rely on individuals to be able to like make the decision, especially with like the way that you just explained that the information is even like shown on packets, or the way that it's explained to us. Like even that 100-gram thing, I often find that confusing when I'm looking at a packet. I'm like, I don't know, is 100 grams like a normal amount? Like that, even that's hard to translate. So it's really complicated.
And this food label approach, so there's a lot of discussion around food labels and their value, or not so much their value. And there are certain ones that tend to work a bit better in helping people choose healthier foods or not. But by and large, the effect of them is rather small compared to what you'd like them to be. Again, because the healthiness of food is only one factor that influences people's purchasing decisions. It's also convenience, habit, availability. And that's the thing, is even for, I obviously work a lot in nutrition research, and I obviously look at all these things, and I often get kind of taken aback. I'm like, decision fatigue, there's so much information. So now when they were saying, we're now going to include the energy intake rate, we're then going to include information about the calorie density, all these kind of things, or even go like a label for calorie density. It's just information overload, and kind of falls back on this sentiment of, well, if people just had more information, they can make better decisions. Whereas I think what we should be doing is going up and saying, well, look at the energy intake rate of these products. Let's now put some kind of regulations on these products to stop them being so accessible and affordable. I think, so like I say, for me, UPF is a useful tool to think about how to better improve the food system. When we talk about individuals, I think just focus on what we already have, because it's too complicated.
And there should also be like absolutely no question that healthy food should be cheaper and more accessible than unhealthy food. Like that should be a given, and it's really sad that it's not.
It's a real shame. Is a piece of work just came out, just to finalise, is it's supply and demand. So if everyone in the UK actually followed the UK dietary guidance, there actually isn't enough fruit and veg to go around for everyone. So we actually have a actual supply issue as well. So it's
well, that's a whole other kettle of fish.
So, end of show question. We like to ask an impossible question. Ultra processed foods are harming health. Is it science or fiction?
I would say it is growing science. The way it's been discussed in the media is more fictional. But when you dig into the details, there's some science there. And with careful interpretation and reviewing it, we can make sure that science is valuable and not having unintended consequences.
Yeah, and not like making people feel like shameful or stigmatized for the way that they eat.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. I just think there's so much more nuance that's needed, and I think it's been over complicated almost in the oversimplification of it, if that makes sense. And so hearing this discussion has been really helpful for me. And what's your thoughts, Catherine? Science or fiction? Oh yeah, go on.
Yeah, I'm always boring in these questions, and I'm just like, there needs to be more nuance. We can't ask this question. I do think that headlines and also like reviews that are published in places like the Lancet that are saying this is harming every organ in your body, I do find headlines like that frustrating, or like comments like that frustrating, because this has been a really fascinating conversation and I understand so much more about how it works now. And that's what we need. That's the nuance that we need. Think it seems like there is evidence for it being, for UPFs generally being linked to poorer health. But as you explained in the way that you did your trial and in the current state of the evidence, there's lots of like looking at associations over time. And that is not the same as being able to say this thing harms this other thing. And that's what we need randomized control trials for, to be able to like isolate those effects.
That was nice to put. Yeah, exactly that. And sometimes it's the language, because I've seen media reports that have used very strong language based on the study design. And as we say, like the large part, UPF contain things we know are poor and not good. And a large part of what they're probably doing is making it easier to eat more calories. And then we know the link between obesity and all of these outcomes. That's probably where most of the evidence is linking to it.
It's a bad combination with this and the rise of TikTok and social media, where it's all short form content and there's no space for nuance. And they kind of like latch on to all of the science and just the final headline and blow it out of proportion a little bit.
My one tip is avoid absolutely everything you read on any social media site about diet. And if you're interested in what to do, Google NHS Eat Well Guide, or if you have a specific problem, go to a GP. Beyond that, ignore everything.
That's really helpful to know, and we'll definitely link the Eat Well guide from the NHS in the show notes as well, so that people can find it easily. I think just to add about the association, like part of the problem is that when you look at these associations between like UPFs in the diet and health, for example, we can't determine that wasn't caused by the packaging, the way that things are advertised, the combination of ingredients, like all these things that you've touched on in terms of like wanting it, it being a certain color, which leads to you wanting to eat more. Like that's the problem with these headlines, because we don't know what those individual causes are. So just to finalize the association point, thank you so much for joining today. I've honestly learned so much about like the different nuances of the conversation, and I think it's also just so helpful to talk about the different levels, like beyond individual behaviors. Like that is often not brought into the conversation when you see things on social media or in the news about ultra processed foods. And like I said, when I started researching this after I'd seen it in the news, I didn't even realize that like cooking was a process, and that was processed food. So I feel like we've come a long way through this conversation, so I really appreciate it.
That's great. Captain Emily, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you all for listening, and thanks again to Sam for coming onto the podcast today. Please rate and subscribe in your favourite podcast app, and sign up to the newsletter on our website, scienceorfiction.co.uk, to get our latest episode in your inbox. We make this podcast with young people to make sure that information is relevant and accessible, and we have some paid opportunities coming up, so keep an eye out in the newsletter and on Instagram at Science or Fiction Podcast. And if you want to suggest a topic or even co-host an episode, you can fill out the form linked on our About page on the website, scienceorfiction.co.uk. Thank you to Emily McLaughlin for producing this episode, and to Kit Studio for the branding and Jamie Johnson for the music. See you next time.